Morning, church. Good morning. I am really excited to just be here and to be involved. My plan for the year is to preach more and more as I have the opportunity at North Boulevard. So thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, to the elders and everybody here, to speak this morning. And thank you all for just taking the time to listen to me. But another good thing is just being here. I'm just really happy to be back after a long summer. I spent a lot of time traveling all over the country this summer, and a thing that was good to see when I got back is how much North Boulevard had been evangelized. And that was a really encouraging thing to see. In my travels, though, I also too was evangelizing. I was trying to do that in my own personal life, the specific people that I knew that I needed to spread the gospel to. So there was one person in particular this summer up in Colorado that I was having a discussion with. And when I was talking to her, one thing that I realized is that it's not that she didn't believe that there was a God. She just believed that God was either too far away or too high above us to actually have a hand in anything that's going on now, anything that we're doing now. Now, that's not something that I agree with, but in looking at that perspective, it pointed to Job for me and answering her questions. And having discussions like that, I feel like most of the time will end up in Job, and the big question of when the big question comes up of what happens when, or why do bad things happen to good people. So open up to Job with me this morning. We're going to start in Job. I wanted to study Job to answer that question. I'd rather answer that question for her. So while you turn into Job and give you a little bit of context of the book, obviously the book is about Job. It's a man who we see are told is blameless. He's upright, he fears God, he turns away from sin. But another thing that we also see about Job is that he is very blessed. We see that he's very prosperous. God has given him a lot. Now, the setting of the book, where Job also lives, is a land called Uz, however you want to pronounce it. But it is a land, a place that's far away from Israel. But the time that the book takes place is not something that we know. However, I think that is something that you can make a judgment based off of the references made in the book. There are references made to the Psalms, to Proverbs, to Ecclesiastes. But I think the author doesn't want us to know the time for the specific reason of just focusing on what's going on with Job and his life and the people that he's interacting with. So that's when the book takes place, but what exactly is going on? So we're going to read the first 2 chapters of Job to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the book. Many of us have been told the story of Job all of our lives, but to get a better understanding in it, and for us all to be in the same place, we'll all read together, and for those who may not know the story as well. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Job, it says, "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. The man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house, each one of them on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where have you come?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?' Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand.' So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another, and said, the fire of God fell from heaven, and burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another, and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels, and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another, and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incite me against him to destroy him without reason. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores, from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. He said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So we see the sons of God have this regular meeting before God, and Satan comes among them. And when in his travels, God asks him if he considers his servant Job. And Job says that he's only faithful to him due to his physical possessions. And so the Lord allows Satan to take those from him. But even in taking those from him, we see that Job doesn't sin against God or charge God. And in the same sense, almost exactly the same, the sons meet again and Satan is with them. And God again asks Satan if he's considered his servant Job. And Satan says this time that it's due to the fact that he still has his physical health is fine. And so God allows him to take that from Job as well. And even in that, we are told by Scripture that Job does not sin against God with his lips. So what's going on here? We have a righteous man suffering. But the big question is why? Why is God allowing this righteous man to suffer? Now, I've been alive for 20 years. I've been raised in the church all my life. And I've never been through a full study of Job. I've heard maybe a few sermons on it, but anytime I've heard people speak on Job, I've heard them focus on the beginning, that prologue. I've heard them focus on the end, that kind of epilogue. But I've always heard people skim over the middle of it. And the middle of it is probably one of the most important parts. Chapters 3 through 31 are a dialogue between Job and his friends. And they explore the why. They look into this question of why bad things happen to good people. But other questions that they also explore that are important are, is God just? And is the world he runs just? Does he run it on justice? So I want to look deeper into that today to kind of give an understanding and kind of share with you guys the things that I've learned from looking into that dialogue or looking into Job. But I think there are a few things that we should look into or consider before getting into that dialogue. So let's look at Job first. One thing to consider, think about, and listening to him in this dialogue, which I recommend if anyone has the time to or has the opportunity to run through that dialogue yourself and read the things that Job has to say and the things that his friends have to say in return to him. But one thing to consider when listening to that dialogue is that Job is on an emotional roller coaster. We all suffer, and I'm sure that we all know people who have gone through a lot of suffering. But I think we're all hard-pressed to find someone who has suffered as much as Job has. We see at the beginning of the book that he's blessed with probably a lot more than any of us can imagine. But we also witness that he loses a lot more than any of us probably will. In such a short amount of time. And so it makes sense for him to be in a struggle with himself and with God. And a lot of the words that we see him say in this dialogue are coming straight out of that frustration. Look with me in Job chapter 16, verse 6. In Job 16, verse 6, he says, "If I speak, my pain is not assuaged. And if I forbear, how much of it leaves me?" And so what he's saying here is that the words he's saying aren't stopping his pains. And they aren't bringing him any more comfort. And so I think that's something that we should think about or understand when looking at some of the things that Job is saying. That this sudden, unimaginable grief is what is making him recognize God's greatness, but at the same time question God and what he's doing. And so I appreciate this part of the book and having Job, or the Bible revealing this side of a person, because it's real. It's really relatable. I think this is something that a lot of us feel ourselves, and if we don't feel it, it's something that we see all the time. But another interesting thing about Job, or interesting to consider about Job, is exactly that, how relatable he is. Now, when having spiritual discussions with people, I've always had a difficult time talking with those who are depressed or those who are going through suicidal things. But when having a study with a person like that, Job is probably a good appeal or a good avenue of talking to them, because Job's situation is probably awfully similar to theirs. In Job chapter 3, Job is so distraught that he wishes that he was never born. Specifically in verse 3, he says, "Let the day perish on which I was born." And in verse 11, he says, "Why did I not die at birth?" Now, these might sound like harsh things for Job to say, but this is the way that people actually feel. People probably say these exact things to other people, or think these things to themselves, and going through a lot of suffering, going through immense stress. So again, Job and his situation are very real and very relatable. And I think that's something we should keep in mind when going through this dialogue that happens in the middle of the book. But not only are there things to consider about Job, but there are also things to consider about his friends. There are three people that come to him and talk to him in this dialogue, being Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Now, hearing different perspectives and different teachings on Job, a lot of people are pretty critical of Job's friends. They label them pretty overall as bad friends, and that's just because of how hard they are on him, and they don't really talk to him like a friend. But it wasn't always like this in Job. Turn with me to chapter 2, because at the end of chapter 2, it tells us that Job's friends were there in his suffering for him. They were supporting him, at least at the beginning. So to the very end of chapter 2, where we left off, in verses 11 through 13. Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. It says, "Now when Job's friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from their own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great." So, at the end of chapter 2, or at least in the very beginning of the story, we see that they sympathized with him and they comforted him. They sat with him in silence for a full week. So at the very least, these friends show us that when you're talking to or dealing with a suffering person and you don't know what to say, sometimes the best thing to say is nothing at all, and to just be there for that person. And so, in that sense, for that reason, I try not to be too hard on Job's friends, because we see that in a way they're friends to him, and they do what they can to comfort him and support him. But I also am not as hard on them and how harsh they're being, because they're just passionate for their God, or at least passionate for their idea of who God is. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 35, Jesus says, "For I have come to set man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." And I think this is a good example of that. They believe Job is doing or saying something that is wrong, or that he's speaking wrongly about God or misrepresenting who God is. And that's why they become so harsh with him. Now, it isn't necessarily right, but I think it's another thing that's relatable. It's another thing that's real. In this past year, probably the 3 most heated discussions or debates I've had are spiritual ones with people who are closest to me. And so I think we can all relate in that way. And I think we've all been there or been at that point. So it's another way that we can't only relate to Job, but we can also relate to Job's friends. It's kind of ironic that Job's friends sit with him for a full week in silence, because for the next 27 or so chapters, they get into a heated debate with him. And it was made clear to me why. It was more so made clear to me why over the years people kind of skimmed over these chapters, because not only are they being translated from Hebrew poetry, but these are really deep and multifaceted arguments. And they can get real confusing, but that's if you look at them alone. Job is an important book in a section of the Old Testament called the wisdom literature. Some of the other books in this section are Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and they also are important books in looking at Job, and they help us to better understand them. And so Job, in this book, knew himself to be innocent, yet he suffered. So he claims that God either doesn't run this world based on justice, or that God himself isn't just. And Job's view is kind of linked to Ecclesiastes. The writer or the speaker, the person called the teacher in Ecclesiastes, claims that at times, kind of like Job does, the wicked do prosper, and that you're not always going to be rewarded for being wise. There's a phrase that he says over and over again, which is vanity, vanity, all is vanity. The Hebrew word, however, being used here is hevel, which has more of a meaning of smoke. This means to say, or this is similar to what Job says in Job chapter 7, verse 7, where he says, remember that my life is a breath. It's just kind of create an understanding that things in life come in many different shapes and many different forms, and when you try to grasp them or hold firm to them, they kind of just evaporate. Trying to get this idea that everything apart from God is temporary. But unlike Job, Ecclesiastes comes to a different conclusion and says that because there are all these things that we aren't in control of, and all is meaningless apart from God, we should trust in His wisdom, which is in control, and enjoy the gifts and small things and simple things that He gives to us. So that's the understanding and perspective that Job has in these debates and these arguments. But his friends have a belief that's more black and white. They claim the Lord is just and runs this world in justice, so kind of the opposite of what Job is claiming. And for this reason, Job's suffering must be a result of him doing something wrong. Turn with me to Job chapter 18, verses 5 through 21. Chapter 18, 5 through 21. It says, indeed, the light of the wicked is put out, and the flame of his fire does not shine. The light is dark in his tent, and his lamp above him is put out. His strong steps are shortened, and his own schemes throw him down. For he is cast into a net by his own feet, and he walks on its mesh. A trap seizes him by the heel, and a snare lays hold of him. A rope is hidden from the wicked in the ground, a trap for him in the path. Terrors frighten him on every side and chase him at his heels. His strength is famished, and calamity is ready for his stomach. It consumes a part of his skin, and the firstborn of death consumes his limbs. He is torn from the tent in which he trusted, and is brought to the king of terrors. In his tent dwells that which is none of his. Sulfur is scattered over his habitation. His roots dry up beneath, and his branches wither above. His memory perishes from the earth, and he has no name in the street. He is thrust from light into darkness and driven out of the world. He has no posterity or progeny among his people, and no survivor where he used to live. They of the west are appalled at his day, and the horror seizes them with ease. Surely such are the dwellings of the unrighteous. Such is the place of him who knows not God. So again, that's Bildad, one of the friends speaking, of how things work for the wicked. And I remember when I was first hearing this, I was thinking to myself that this sounds like something out of a movie. You know, where you have a situation where times may seem bad, but the good always prosper, and the good always reign above the bad guy. However, this idea that Job's friends have is kind of reflective of Proverbs. Proverbs is, unlike Ecclesiastes, is more of an optimistic book when it comes to talking about wisdom. is a book full of wisdom, and the Proverbs in it help people to better live their lives and live in accordance with God. The problem is that the Proverbs are situational. They're meant to are meant to help those of many different ages, and many different generations, and many different situations. So for that reason, they aren't formulaic. They aren't guaranteed a good reward. And we see that in Job's life and in what Job is going through. So these are the two perspectives that are argued between Job and his friends. And at the end of the book, we have two more people who come and correct these people. And the first person is Elihu, who is probably my favorite person in this book. The reading that Andrew kindly read for us earlier is coming from Elihu. And that's him being in awe and recognizing how great God is and using that as kind of an argument or something, or wisdom to prove against Job and his friends. What I like about him is that he's younger than Job and his friends. He's filled with anger when he hears what they have to say, but he keeps silent for all this time because he's younger than them. In respect for them, he lets them speak first. But what's cool is that although he's younger, he still has wisdom to correct these men. I remember my mom would, and I'm sure all of us, just going throughout our lives is the voice in the back of our head, and whatever we're doing is our mother speaking. And for me, one of the things that she always used to say was out of the mouth of a babe, which simply means that a child is young and they're inexperienced and naive, but from time to time, just because this unfiltered truth will come out of their mouth, sometimes you'll hear things that still hold true, or things that can change a person's life, or things that can strike you to the heart. And I think that's exactly what happens here with Elihu in speaking to Job and his friends. Another thing that I think is cool in this situation with Elihu when he comes to correct them is that he doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he still says things that are wiser than Job and his friends. Look with me in Job chapter 34, verses 12 and 17. It's basically the end of the dialogue between Job and his friends. They don't really speak anymore. But now Elihu says, I will speak. It's chapter 34, verses 12 and 17. In verse 12, Elihu says, of a truth, God will not do wickedly. The Almighty will not pervert justice. Then in verse 17, he says, shall one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is righteous and almighty? This is kind of reflective of, this is kind of reflective of Luke chapter 18. Here Elihu says that God does not pervert justice and he is the ultimate judge. And this is an idea we see in the parable in Luke chapter 18. In that parable, Jesus tells of an older woman who is going to this judge. And this judge does not care about his job, and he does not care about the people. But this older woman comes to him and she nags him about the thing that she wants and the revenge that she wants every day. And eventually, he gives it to her. He gives her the things that he wants, but not because he cares about justice or he cares about his people or cares about the job, but because he's tired of this woman nagging him. In the parable, it's not talking about God, but it's talking about in comparison to God, because God is not that judge. He's someone who does care about justice. He's someone who does care about his people. He's someone who isn't burdened by human things, is always ready and always willing to bring about justice and do his job. And that's kind of what Elihu is saying here, is God is that ultimate judge. You know, would someone who hates justice govern, right? Would God be unjust in that way or in that reason? He also suggests to these men that the suffering that God allows may have a reason, right? It may be for building character or for teaching things. But one thing that he knows for sure is that Job is wrong to call God unjust. So Elihu is the first person that comes along and he corrects Job, but the other person who comes along and corrects Job is his friends. Job and his friends is God himself. We see him kind of take Job on this virtual tour, and he paints this picture of the universe for him to show him how vast and complex it is, but at the same time how disorderly and dangerous it is. So it opens Job's eyes and lets him see how small his suffering is in this vast universe and amongst all that is going on. And in coming and correcting him, we see that God doesn't answer that question. He doesn't give Job that question. He doesn't explain to him why he is suffering. He doesn't explain to him why bad things are happening to to good people. But what he does tell Job, ultimately, Job's perspective is way too small to be making the claims that he's making. When God takes things into action, when he's doing things, he sees the whole universe. And he knows how it works. And it's with this knowledge that God takes the actions that he does. And that's God's wisdom. Elihu kind of alludes to this or says this in Job chapter 37, verse 13. He says, whether for correction or for this land or for love, he causes it to happen. And this, he's saying that whatever the reason is for what God does, is for a reason. There may be several, or it may be one that we just don't understand. But Job and his friends' wisdom, unlike God, comes from themselves. And it comes from what they've experienced. They even say it themselves. They're pulling their knowledge from of old in Job chapter 20, verse 4. And Elihu gets angry for them with this reason. Gets angry with them for this reason in Job chapter 32, verse 9. So, looking at that, I think we begin to understand, or we begin to relate even more with Job, because we begin to be like Job when we're in this suffering. It's like in a breakup. When you talk to two people in a breakup, normally when it's a bad one, not a neutral one, you ask them things that happen and they both want to be the victim. They both want to pull things on themselves. So even the person who did the breaking up, they're like, oh yeah, I broke up with so-and-so, but this happened to me, or I feel this way, or I'm upset about this. When we're going through suffering, we kind of become that person that wants to be a victim in a relationship with God. We lose sight of who he is. We forget all the things that he does for us. We forget the wisdom and the judgment and the things that he sees when he's taking action. When we think about ourselves, we lose sight of him in the midst of our suffering. We begin to be like Job's friends when we start to judge people based off of their distresses, based off of what they got going on, and when we assume how God's justice works. And I think we can relate to this one even more because I think we see it more often. I think one good example is with the homeless. It's kind of hard to judge or kind of hard to decide what to do when dealing with them. I know some people say or know or make a guess or assume that they are where they are because of decisions, bad decisions that they've made, or bad decisions that they continue to make, when in actuality or in truth, we don't know what they're going through. We don't know their story. We don't know what brought them to the point that they are. Yeah, they could be taking the money that we give them to go spend it on drugs or go spend it on bad things, or they could be in Job's situation. They can be a good person. They can be a righteous person, and they can be just the grand scheme of the universe and God taking the action they did and them ending up on the short end of the stick, just like we see with Job in his story. So in Job 28, chapter 28 and verse 28, and in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, it tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And this doesn't only mean to have reverence towards God, but it also means to know that I don't get to make up my own definition of what's right and what's wrong. And this is exactly what we see Job and his friends do. I more so, in fearing of God, must humble myself to embrace his wisdom and follow his definitions of what are right and what are wrong. God's might. God is almighty. He's the Most High. And for that reason, I must trust in his wisdom to get me through this life of temporary goods and good and bad, to lead me on to greater things. One of those greater things is an eternal good, and that's heaven. And so, in looking at what we've learned about Job today, if you are a Christian here today, you can kind of look at your life and look at your story, and if you've already been accepted in the Christ Church, but maybe going through a time like that, you may be suffering, you may be dealing with a lot, and that may be causing you to have that same frustration, that same struggle that Job is. You may be wrestling with yourself or wrestling with God, questioning him, having trouble with him, wondering why. This is an opportunity for you to get any kind of help that you may need with it. If we can pray for you, or if we can in any way do something to meet your needs as a Christian, this is an opportunity for you to get that help. If you're here and you aren't a Christian, you don't have a hand in that eternal good. You don't have that access to heaven yet, and you'd like to be baptized and become a part of Christ's Church. This is an opportunity for you as well. So So if you're a Christian here in need of help, or you're not a Christian and would like to become one, we ask that you come to the front as we together stand and sing.